haircut and a brand new President's Challenge. And this is the third and final time that I have my initials by the President's Challenge. And for this month, August, is undercut rim. Make a vessel with the rim noticeably smaller than the maximum inside diameter of the piece. Now, similar to last month's challenge, the reason I suggested this as a challenge is because doing an undercut rim poses certain challenges. The main challenge when doing an undercut rim is that because we're in face work and because we're on an inside surface, we want to cut from the larger diameter to the smaller diameter. But in the case of an undercut rim, there's no way to get a cutting tool in the right position to make that cut. So you have to come up with some other way of doing it. Also similar to last month's President's Challenge, I had suggested this before I had committed myself to doing President's Challenge videos. And so once again I have a situation where just showing how to do an undercut rim isn't enough to fill up a whole video. So once again I had to come up with some value added feature. Now the last time I did an undercut rim, I actually also added a segmented rim to it, and I thought that maybe we could do that. But then I realized a lot of turners out there might be exclusively turners and they don't do flatwood. Either they don't have the skills or they don't have the facilities to deal with flatwood. And even if you are able to work with flatwood, you have to come up with a special jig to be able to cut out the segments for a rim like this. But then I realized the same material we used to solve last month's problem, that is commercial veneer, can actually be cut with scissors. So why not make this segmented rim out of commercial veneer? Since it's going to take a little bit of time to show how to do the segmented rim, I already did most of my bowl or my undercut rim off camera. This is a piece of pear that's been sitting in my stock since about 2009. It was roughed out green, and I retrued it. I still have a little bit of work to do on the inside, but I want to get the rim on first. And if you notice, I took it off with the whole chuck. Last time when I tried to remove it from the chuck for clamping, for gluing on the veneer, and no matter how hard you try to get it in the chuck exactly the same way, it's always going to be off just a hair. And since we don't have a lot of thickness on the rim, you risk blowing through. I think that's what happened last President's Challenge when I blew through the rim. So this time I'm actually going to clamp. I'm going to leave it in the chuck, and I'm going to clamp it with the chuck, and that way I can put it back on the lathe exactly the way it came off. So we'll put that aside. So a few items. Minimum for being able to do this segmented rim: a good pair of scissors, of course, because we're going to use that instead of saws to cut the veneer, an angle gauge because we'll have to measure the angles for the different segments, a good pencil. I like to use a mechanical pencil with a 0.5 millimeter lead. That way I can get it. You have to be fairly precise, not super precise, and a ruler, of course. You should have that in your shop anyways. A strip of sandpaper, 220 or maybe 180 or whatever you have, around that grit, and plenty of blue tape because we're going to put the segments together with blue tape. A couple of optional items that I find helpful when doing this kind of work. This is called a self-healing mat. It's really nice because you can cut right into it. It's soft. You cut right into it, and it eventually leaves scratches. But it's really nice to be able to cut directly into. Also, either a really sharp X-Acto knife or a really sharp utility knife, perhaps even with fresh blades. And if you have eyes that are old like me, some reading glasses so you can see what you're doing. And finally, some bits of veneer. I have several that I'm trying to decide what I want to do with. This is some bobinga left over from a coffee table I did. This is some English walnut from a cabinet I did, and I have some other bits here. I have some zebra wood, and as well I have some figured mahogany, and I even have some ribbon sapele. I'm just trying to decide what I want to do. Which one I think is going to look the best. Now, being commercial veneer, there's a lot of ways we could make this segmented rim. But there's one way called, if you've done veneering before, you're probably already familiar with it, called book matching. When you get, and for this, you're going to need 2 pieces of veneer that came from the same flitch. That is, usually when you buy veneer, it comes in a whole stack like this, and these have been sliced out of the tree consecutively, and so the grain from one piece to the next is very close to identical. Now, if you take 2 pieces, consecutive pieces from a flitch, and you open one up like a book, you can see that the grain is basically a mirror image. So you have continuous grain as you put these together. The grain flows continuously along the seam. And you can do it that way, or we can also open it this way. And you can see you can line up the grain on the end, and it seems to be continuous. And so we're going to take advantage of that to make our segment have continuous grain like I did with this piece. You can see every time there's a joint, almost, it's not perfect, but very close, the grain is continuous all the way around. Now the best bet when you want to do a book match like this is to find something with nice straight grain. Probably the easiest one to get to work would be this mahogany because it's nice and straight. But the one I think would look the best with this is this leftover bubinga. But I'm taking a little bit of a risk because as I cut these out, if the grain changes from one segment to the other too much, I'll get less than a grain match. But I'm going to go for it anyways. I'm going to see maybe I just need to get lucky, or maybe it's not as sensitive as I think it is. So I'm going to try this. I've decided to go with the bubinga. The next thing I need to decide is how many segments do I want on my rib. And this one has 16, but I figured out afterwards that it's much easier to use a number that divides evenly into 180. So this time I'm going to go with 18 segments. That's going to give me an angle. My segment pieces, this angle right here is going to end up being 10 degrees. That's a little bit easier to set up on my angle gauge. Now this angle gauge, this happens to be 90, so I actually have to take 90 minus 10 and set my angle gauge to 80. We'll set it here, and then we'll set it on that side to do the other set of lines. The other piece of information I have to figure out is how long do my segments need to be, and I'm referencing from the outside of my segments. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the diameter of my rim, the outside diameter, and it's about 5, and I'm going to add a 1/4 inch to each side just to make sure I have enough material to cover the whole rim. It might come out a little bit small, a little bit large, so I'm going to go with 5.5 as my bowl diameter. 5.5 inches in diameter. Now you can go onto charts online and look at different segmented turning forums, and you can find different charts that will tell you. You can look up on the chart, given this diameter and given this number of segments or that angle, it'll tell you how long this outside piece needs to be. But there's a really easy way, even if you're not a math guru, there's an easy way to do it right on a calculator. And so what I do is I take my 10 degrees, make sure you have your calculator in degrees mode, not radians, and I take 10 degrees, I hit this button tan, and I multiply that times my rim diameter, and that will tell me how long my segment needs to be. So I got 0.96, really close to 1 inch. So I'm just going to call that 1 inch. So I know my outside segments need to be 1 inch. Now since I'm doing a book match, I need both pieces, so I'm going to lay out 9 pieces on one piece of veneer and the other 9 on the other. And so that means 1 inch for 9 segments. That's about 9.5 inches. And I'm going to cut these out a little bit longer. But I'm just kind of looking at the grain here to see what grain I like the most that I think I want in my rim. And I think over here is just fine. I'll measure about, since I need 9 inches, I'm going to measure about 9.5. And I'll cut those off. And since when I lay these out, since I'm going to do 9 on one and 9 on the other, I want to make sure when I lay them out as a book match. So I'm going to open this up now like this. And I'm going to work on this one first, but I don't want to forget. If wind blows or I get up or something happens and I forget which side I'm supposed to do this on, so I'm just going to tape that right there so I don't forget. And I'm going to start laying out this one. I'm going to make, this is my outside edge, so I'm going to line these up. I'm going to leave about 1/4 inch on either end, and we'll see why that is soon enough. And I'm going to mark, since my segment sizes are 1 inch, I'm going to mark these off in 1 inch intervals. Since my angle that I'm dealing with is 10 degrees, I'm going to set this to 10 degrees, or because this is a referenced off of 90, I'm going to 90 minus 10 was actually 80, so that'll give me 10 degrees. And I'm going to, right off of those marks that I left, I'm going to strike my 10 degrees. You want to try to get these as accurate as you can, but don't sweat too much over accuracy. You'll see as we put the two halves together, there's a way that we can absorb any error that's accumulated while we've been laying and cutting these out. And now I'll reset this to 10 degrees on the other side, or in the case of this angle gauge, 80 degrees. And I'll do the same thing over again. And since I only need 1 inch, I'm going to go ahead and trim this off. All that extra is just going to get in the way. And I'll start cutting out and putting these segments together. Now this very first one on the end, I don't want to cut that one just yet, and we'll see why that is. So I want to start cutting out this little V right here. So all these little triangles in the middle here, that's my waist. So just being as careful as possible to cut straight in the line. Just make my snip like that. And then what I'll do, sometimes if you're not perfectly straight, that's what the sandpaper's for. You just take a flat surface and very carefully stand this up on edge and make a couple passes like this. It all squares off the edge really nice. It'll mate nicely, much more nicely to the next piece. And make my next cut. Once again, flatten off that edge. This is my second segment. And I'll check the fit. Oops, maybe it's upside down. There we go. You can see how that grain just about matches. So I want to try to line up, I want to make sure that the seam looks pretty good. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't want to have any significant gaps in there. You're always going to see a line once it's glued, but I don't want to have any significant gaps. And what I'll do at this point is take a little piece of blue tape. I'll add more later. Right now I just want to hold it in place while I make the rest of this. You can see the risk with using something that's perfectly straight grain is that when you cut this waist piece out, if there's a lot of deviation of the grain across this piece, then it's going to be a little bit harder to line up each piece. But this, so far, this piece, I'm lucky, it looks pretty good. I'm just going to put a piece of blue tape to hold it. And I'm going to continue with my next segment. Alright, so the first half is done, the first 9 segments are done, and it looks a bit odd here because I haven't trimmed the ends yet, but it is pretty close to a half a rim here. We'll take care of that later. Right now I want to set up the other half, the other set of segments, and because I took this piece and I flipped it over like a book, if you look at where this grain ends and when this grain picks up, you can see that it's matching. And so by the time I finish doing all the segments on this piece, it's going to end right around and it'll match on the other side as well. So we'll have continuous grain all the way around the rim. Alright, now that I have both halves complete, you'll see why I left a little extra on there. And the reason is, no matter how accurately we try to cut and mark, it's always going to be off a little bit, the angles. And instead of trying to fiddle with the last one to get the angles right, if you do them in halves and then cut this straight across, these will necessarily fit together. So I want the lines just as sort of a reference. I want them to be close as possible. In fact, I'm going to mark just about in the middle of each one. And then I'm going to take a straight edge or a ruler, and I'm going to try to line. First I'm going to go this side just to see, are these segments going to look reasonably correct? And those look pretty good. So I'm going to move it to this side, and I want to be right on the centers. Now, if you only have scissors, you can go ahead and mark this and then cut them and then try to sand them. But this is why this is where I like to use that sharp X-Acto knife or utility knife. And you may have to make several passes even if the veneer is kind of thick. And now I need to sand these edges to make them fit neatly. But before I take this whole thing and put up an edge, I want to put a bunch more tape on here just to keep things together while I'm doing that. And hopefully I have a decent fit right here. Now you can see that these individually line up pretty well, nice and tight, and the grain lines up, and same on this side, lines up, and the grain, no gaps, and the grain lines up. And in fact, if I go straight across, the angles are the same. They still fit nice and tightly together. The problem I have now is, look, at one is a little bit shifted. If I want to get that grain to line up on both ends and be able to put this together. Now, if it was off about 1/8 of an inch, you could just fudge it, and if it's and your veneer will curl up a little bit on one end, but that'll all come out in the glue. But 1/4 inch is a little too much. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to take this back apart on one side, the longer piece, probably the better one to work with, and I'm going to have to tweak a little bit right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off just a hair off of each one of these. That helped out a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and finish these off. And this last one can get a little tricky because it won't be aligned perfectly. I'm just going to go like so. It's not lying perfectly flat, but that should come out in the glue up. I can flip it over, press it flat, and we can see that air will spread out. Alright, so this is my glue side, and this is my show side. Alright, time to glue my segmented veneer rim to my bull rim. And I got my favorite glue bottle here. I'm just going to put a nice bead of glue. I'm not too worried about squeeze out, because it's all going to squeeze out onto the blue tape or my parchment paper. So I have some neoprene, or you can use cork. A little bit of cush always helps to get a nice contact with the veneer against the rim of the bowl. And I'm using parchment paper instead of wax paper because someone pointed out that it releases a lot more better than wax paper, and that's true. I can't remember someone in one of the comments mentioned that. So I'm going to flip this upside down. You've kind of decided on the pattern that you like, so you kind of want this centered. Now if I just clamp it right away, it might slide around. So if you play with it a little bit, squeeze it back and forth until it gets a nice tack. And it looks like I have a nice 1/4 inch all the way around. And I'm just going to clamp it straight right on the chuck. Tight bond says ½ an hour clamping time. I'll probably let it go for an hour, go eat lunch and come back, and we can finish up the bowl on the lathe. Right, so some Memphis style ribs, grilled vegetables, and an espresso later, and this should be ready. Food should be on well enough that we can work it. Now, one thing you have to be careful of, I found with blue tape, is that even though it's supposed to quick release, and it usually does, when you put it under pressure, either that or when you get glue on it, it tends to grab on the fibers. So you have to be careful pulling it back. And if it starts to tear out the fibers, what I like to do is soften it a little bit with naphtha or mineral spirits. The difference is naphtha, it's about the same thing, but it dries a little bit faster. Try to get that in there to soften up the glue on the blue tape so you can get it off without tearing out the fibers on the veneer. This one's coming off fairly well. When I did the zebra wood, it would grab a lot more than this. Alright, looks pretty good. The joints look pretty tight. Now, what's going to happen when I go to, if I go on the lathe right now and try to cut this off, all this loose stuff out here, if I manage to cut through and not back up where there's actual pear wood, it could tear into my rim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to trim as much of this away as I can, and that's going to help me not only remove anything that might tear out or rip away, it helps me see right where I can enter my tool, so I can make sure I have wood backing up when I cut into the veneer. And I'll do the same on the inside, but I can't get my scissors in there, so I'm going to be very careful and use an X-Acto knife. Alright, time to launch it back onto the lathe. And let's just check to see how true it is. Yeah, much better leaving it right in the chuck. That's perfectly true still. I have to be really careful at this point because as I cut through this veneer, I want to make sure that I'm cutting into the pear wood behind it, because otherwise it could rip the veneer right off the rim. So I'm going to get really on my tippy toes right now. I could go in a little bit further to make sure, but I don't have a lot of rim left. So I'm going to get on my tippy toes so I can eyeball it. And voila. Now, got to manage to do the same thing on the inside. I have to be extra careful here too because I don't want this tool to skate back across the veneer. There's no hope of fixing it. So I'm going to make sure I have my thumb really tight. So there's the rim. Now I just got to finish the inside. Now with some undercut bowls, if they're undercut severely, you have to go right to a scraper to get underneath this rim. But the other thing we can do in this case, since this isn't too severely undercut, we can try to go against the grain. And I think the tool that might work the best for me in this case is my 1/4 inch bowl gouge. with that. So that worked out pretty well. And the negative rake scraper cleaned up any tear out that was in there. But getting into the bottom of this bowl is a little bit tricky. I can't get a gouge quite in there. So I'm going to just go ahead and finish the bottom of the bowl with a scraper. I haven't done a video on scrapers yet. I'm hoping to do one soon. But in general, what I find is that when you use a scraper for purposes of hollowing, thicker is always better, just to get rid of the vibration. If you're just using a scraper for detail and you're over the tool rest just a half an inch or so, 1/4 inch thick is fine. But as soon as you start hanging over the tool rest, vibration with a scraper becomes a big issue. So I always go with big and heavy. They are expensive, but it's really not worth trying to do something like this with a thin scraper. Alright, there it is. A pearwood bowl, undercut rim, and the veneer, the segmented Bubinga veneer rim on it. And not all of the segments lined up perfectly, but because it's dark enough, it doesn't really seem to matter. I decided to go with a finish that I used to use all the time in furniture until I changed to pre-cat lacquer, water locks. I keep hearing about turners using water locks on their turnings, so I thought I'd give that a try. And I was actually hoping to have a little bit of a wider rim, more like this one. But now that I look at it, I think this is a good way to go too. You could even put this on a non-undercut bowl, add some kind of accent rim using commercial veneer. Now, although I use the book match on these two bowls for my rim, because this is commercial veneer and you can cut it with scissors, there's all kinds of possibilities you can do. You can imagine arranging your segments radially. That is from going from the center outwards, making your segments go around that way. That would be pretty cool. Or you could alternate species every other segment. You can make, say, walnut and maple. Check out some of the segmented turnings online to get some ideas. Anything you can do on one layer on a segmented turning, you can do on a rim using commercial veneer. So that's what I have here this time, and if you were hoping to have some kind of big fail or something explode in a lathe this President's Challenge, unfortunately everything went fairly well this time. So until next time, I'm Brian Havens, and thanks for watching.